The man who died first was never supposed to matter. That was the problem. His name appeared once in a local police blotter, buried between reports of stolen cars and domestic disputes. No photo, no follow-up, just a sentence stating that the case had been closed. Accidental death. No foul play suspected. Evan read the line 3 times, trying to understand how something so final could be written so casually. He didn't know the man personally. Not really. They had shared an apartment building years ago, exchanged nods in the hallway, small talk about the weather, nothing that lasted long enough to leave a mark. And yet, Evan remembered his face. That was what unsettled him. The memory came back slowly, uninvited. The man standing in the stairwell late at night, arguing with someone Evan never saw. The sound of a door slamming, a muffled shout that stopped too suddenly. The next morning, the man was gone. Management said he'd moved out. Now, years later, Evan stared at the article on his laptop, his chest tight for reasons he couldn't explain. He scrolled. There was nothing else. No investigation details, no interviews, no explanation of how a healthy man in his 30s simply fell down a flight of stairs and died. Evan closed the laptop and sat back in his chair. The room felt heavier than it had a moment ago. At first, Evan blamed stress. He had been working long hours, sleeping poorly. Old memories resurfaced sometimes when you were tired enough, but the feeling didn't fade. It stayed with him through the night, a dull pressure behind his ribs, like something pressing outward from inside. He dreamed of stairwells, long, narrow ones that twisted downward without end. He kept descending, passing doors that were all locked, all marked with the same number scratched into the wood. When he reached the bottom, something was waiting, not moving, not breathing, just present. Evan woke up gasping, his sheets damp with sweat. The pressure in his chest remained. Over the next few days, small things began to change. Sounds lingered longer than they should have. Footsteps echoed even after he stopped walking. His reflection in windows seemed slower, as if it needed a moment to decide whether to follow his movements. Once, in the bathroom mirror, Evan thought he saw someone standing behind him. When he turned, the room was empty. He stopped using mirrors after that. The pressure grew worse at night. Not painful, persistent. It felt like being watched from inside his own body. On the 4th night, Evan heard a voice, not out loud, inside his head. It didn't speak in sentences. It showed him images. A stairwell, a body at the bottom, a face twisted in shock, not fear. The man hadn't expected to die. That detail cut deeper than the rest. Evan clutched the edge of the bed and whispered for it to stop. The images faded. The pressure eased slightly. Relief washed through him so suddenly it made him dizzy. Evan noticed the connection immediately. Fear made it worse. Attention made it stronger. Resistance made it unbearable. The next evening, Evan returned to the old building. It had been renovated. New paint, new tenants, a keypad on the front door. He shouldn't have been able to get inside. But someone exited as he approached, holding the door open without looking at him. Inside, the stairwell looked the same. Same narrow steps, same dim lighting, same corner where the man had stood years ago, arguing with someone unseen. Evan stood there, listening. The building was quiet, too quiet. Then the pressure surged. The images returned, sharper now. Hands pushing, a misstep, a body tumbling down. Evan staggered back, gripping the railing. "No," he whispered. "That's not how it happened." The pressure spiked. A new image forced itself into his mind. A door closing, voices lowering, a decision made quickly, then buried. This wasn't an accident. The man had been pushed, and afterward, no one had wanted to know. The pressure eased again, like a breath released. Evan sank onto the steps, shaking. He understood then. Something had been born the moment the truth was buried. Not a ghost, not yet. Something made of denial, of silence, of a death that had never been allowed to end properly. That night, Evan couldn't sleep. When he closed his eyes, he saw the man's face again. Not angry, not accusing, waiting. In the early hours of the morning, Evan felt the pressure shift. Not heavier, focused. The images returned one last time, another person, another place, a man alone in an apartment, pacing, furious, already close to violence. The feeling that followed was unmistakable. Urgency. The pressure in Evan's chest grew unbearable until he whispered, "What do you want?" The answer came instantly, not as words, as certainty. One death had been hidden. It demanded balance, not justice, completion. Evan doubled over, gasping as the pressure vanished. Relief flooded his body, warm and immediate. For the first time since the nightmares began, he could breathe. The voice was gone. The silence that followed felt earned. Evan sat there in the dark, horrified by the thought forming in his mind. If silence fed it, then action would satisfy it. Evan told himself he wouldn't act on it. That thought lasted until the pressure returned. It came the next evening, subtle at first, like a hand resting lightly against his chest. Not painful, not demanding, just present. He tried to ignore it. He cooked dinner. He turned on the television. He answered emails he had been putting off. Each distraction worked for a few minutes, then faded. The pressure remained. When he finally sat down in the dark, the images returned. Not the stairwell this time, a different apartment, smaller, messier. A man pacing between the kitchen and the living room, his movements sharp and agitated. Empty bottles on the counter. A cracked phone face down on the table. The man's jaw was clenched. His hands shook when he tried to light a cigarette. Evan felt it immediately. This one was close, not physically, morally. The pressure tightened, and with it came something new. A feeling Evan didn't expect. Agreement. The man in the vision wasn't innocent. Evan didn't need details to know that. Violence clung to him the way guilt clung to the dead man in the stairwell. The pressure eased slightly, as if in approval. Evan stood up, heart racing. "No," he said aloud, testing the word. "I'm not doing this." The pressure spiked, his breath caught, his knees buckled, and he grabbed the back of a chair to steady himself. The images sharpened. This time they came with context. Arguments overheard through thin walls, a woman flinching, a neighbor turning up the television to drown out shouting, police visits that ended with warnings and paperwork. No arrests, no follow-up. Evan understood the pattern. This wasn't random. The thing inside him wasn't demanding innocent blood. It was selecting what the world had already decided not to handle. The pressure eased, again, slow and deliberate. Evan slid down to the floor, shaking. "That doesn't make it right," he whispered. The silence that followed felt patient. That night, Evan dreamed he was standing in a room full of doors. Each door had a name scratched into it. Some names were crossed out, others were circled. One door stood open at the end of the room. The man from the vision stood inside, unaware that the floor beneath him was already gone. Evan woke before dawn, his heart pounding. The pressure was still there, but it wasn't as strong. It felt expectant. Evan spent the morning researching. Not the man from the vision, not yet. He searched for the dead man from the stairwell. It took hours to piece together fragments, old neighborhood forums, archived complaints, a single comment buried in a thread about building safety. Someone had heard shouting that night. Someone had called management. Someone had been told to mind their own business. The pressure surged briefly, then receded. Evan leaned back in his chair, nausea rolling through him. This was how it worked. The thing inside him wasn't creating violence. It was finishing what negligence had started. By late afternoon, Evan couldn't tell where his own thoughts ended and the pressure began. He tried leaving the apartment. The moment he stepped outside, the pressure intensified, sharp enough to steal his breath. It didn't stop until he turned back and closed the door. Containment. The thing didn't want him wandering. It wanted him focused. That evening, the images returned without warning. The man's apartment door, unlocked, a familiar layout Evan somehow already knew. The pressure became unbearable. Evan pressed his palms against his chest, gasping. "Just tell me how," he whispered. The relief was immediate. Not complete, but enough. Images flooded his mind, not of violence, but of absence. No neighbors nearby, no witnesses, no one who would ask questions soon enough to matter. The pressure settled into something almost comfortable. Evan grabbed his jacket. The night air felt wrong, thicker than it should have been. Streetlights hummed too loudly. Every sound seemed amplified, as if the world itself was listening. He followed the route the images suggested without questioning how he knew it. The apartment building was older, poorly maintained. The kind of place people passed without looking twice. Evan paused outside the door. For the first time, doubt cut through the pressure. "What if I'm wrong?" he whispered. "What if this is just in my head?" The pressure surged violently. Images flashed. Not of the man this time, of the stairwell, of the dead man's face at the bottom, eyes open, mouth twisted in confusion. Evan staggered back, nearly falling. The message was clear. This wasn't about certainty. It was about closure. Evan knocked. The man opened the door, irritation already on his face. "What do you want?" he snapped. Up close, he looked worse than in the vision. Hollow-eyed, unsteady, anger simmering just beneath the surface. Evan didn't answer right away. The pressure pressed inward, urging, aligning his thoughts. "I need to talk to you," Evan said finally. The man scoffed but stepped aside. Inside, the air felt charged. Evan noticed the small details immediately. The clenched fists, the way the man positioned himself closer to the door, blocking it without realizing. They talked. At first about nothing important, noise complaints, misunderstandings, frustrations. Then the man's temper flared. Words sharpened. Accusations flew. Evan felt the pressure peak. This was the moment. He didn't think of himself as acting. It felt more like stepping aside and letting something inevitable pass through him. Afterward, the apartment was silent. The man lay still on the floor, his expression frozen somewhere between rage and surprise. No blood, no spectacle, just absence. The pressure vanished completely. Evan collapsed into a chair, gasping, tears streaming down his face. Relief crashed over him, overwhelming and immediate. His chest felt light, his thoughts cleared. The constant sense of being watched disappeared. For a moment, Evan laughed, a broken, disbelieving sound. "I'm free," he whispered. As he stood to leave, he noticed something on the table, a folded piece of paper he hadn't seen before. His hands shook as he opened it. Inside, a single sentence was written in cramped, unfamiliar handwriting. This is how it starts. The pressure returned, faint but unmistakable. Not hungry, satisfied. Evan stepped out into the night, understanding too late that the first death hadn't ended anything. It had taught the thing inside him exactly what kind of man he was willing to become. Evan didn't dream that night. He expected nightmares, screaming, blood, the man's face frozen in that final moment. None of it came. He slept deeply without interruption, as if his body had been waiting for permission to rest. When he woke, the pressure was gone. Completely. The absence felt unnatural. Evan lay still for a long time, listening to the quiet of his apartment. No hum beneath his ribs, no sense of being watched, just silence. Relief settled over him like a blanket. Then came the guilt. It arrived slowly, cautiously, as if unsure whether it was welcome. Evan let it sit there, heavy and dull, while another feeling rose beneath it. Justification. He replayed the night in his mind, not as violence, but as sequence. Cause and effect. The man's anger, the history the images had shown him, the way the world had already failed to intervene. "I didn't start this," Evan whispered. The words sounded reasonable. The pressure did not return. That became important. Over the next few days, Evan tested the silence. He went back to work. He smiled when coworkers asked how he was doing. He answered emails he had ignored for weeks. No images came, no whispers. At night he slept. The thing inside him was quiet. On the fourth day, Evan read the news. The man's death was reported briefly. No name yet, no details beyond found unresponsive in his apartment. The comments beneath the article filled quickly. About time. Knew something was wrong with him. Surprised it didn't happen sooner. Evan closed the page, his stomach twisting. The pressure flickered faintly, then settled again. Approval. Evan leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. "This is what you wanted," he said softly. The silence did not contradict him. That night, Evan noticed something new. When he closed his eyes, the images didn't force themselves into his mind. They waited, hovering just out of reach, like thoughts he could choose to follow if he wanted to. That scared him. He tested it carefully. He thought about the stairwell. The pressure remained absent. He thought about the man in the apartment. A faint warmth spread through his chest. Encouragement. Evan understood then. The thing inside him no longer needed to push. It trusted him. The next image came 2 nights later. Not sudden, not violent. It slipped into his thoughts while he was washing dishes. A woman standing in a kitchen very much like his. Her shoulders hunched, her hands clenched around the edge of the counter. A child crying in another room. Evan's breath caught. The pressure returned, light but unmistakable. Not pain, expectation. He dropped the plate into the sink. "No," he said immediately. "I'm not doing that." The pressure didn't spike. It didn't argue. Instead, the image expanded. The woman's face twisted in exhaustion. The way she flinched when something crashed behind her, the bruise half hidden beneath her sleeve. Evan felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Not compulsion. Recognition. He shut his eyes hard. "That's not my responsibility," he said. The image faded. The pressure eased slightly, but it didn't leave. It lingered, patient. That was worse. Evan spent the night pacing. The thing wasn't demanding action. It was letting him consider. By morning, he was exhausted. He told himself he was done. One death had been enough. More than enough. The pressure seemed to accept this, retreating into the background of his thoughts. For 3 days, nothing happened. Then Evan passed a man on the street who made his stomach turn. It wasn't his appearance, it was the feeling. The pressure surged briefly, sharp and unmistakable, then faded. Evan stopped walking. He turned. The man was already moving away, blending into the crowd. Evan stood there, heart pounding. The thing inside him had reacted without images, without preparation. It had recognized something. That night, Evan dreamed again. He was back in the stairwell, but this time the steps were clean. No body at the bottom, no blood, just doors lining the walls, all open now. Inside each room stood a person. Some looked afraid, some angry, some calm. All of them looked unfinished. At the end of the stairwell stood the man who had died years ago, the one whose death had been hidden. He didn't look injured, he looked whole, but his eyes were empty. "You're doing it wrong," Evan said to him. The man shook his head. "You are," the voice answered, speaking through the dream. Evan woke with the pressure crushing his chest. Images flooded his mind, faster than before. Not one person, several. Connections formed, patterns overlapped, people the system had ignored. Violence delayed, not prevented. The thing inside him wasn't satisfied. One death had proven Evan capable. Now it wanted consistency. Evan sat on the edge of his bed, breathing hard. "You said this was about balance," he whispered, "about finishing what was hidden." The pressure shifted. The image of the stairwell returned. The body at the bottom, eyes open, mouth frozen in disbelief. Then a new image layered over it. Another body, another place, another silence. Evan understood the truth with sickening clarity. The first death hadn't created balance. It had created precedent. The thing born from the hidden death didn't want justice for the past. It wanted to ensure there would never be another unfinished one. Not by exposing them, by adding to them. Evan pressed his hands to his face. "If I stop," he said, "what happens?" The pressure eased just enough to let the answer through. Images of chaos, of deaths louder and uglier, of people caught in the spillover when violence went unchecked. The thing didn't threaten, it predicted. Evan lowered his hands slowly. The pressure settled into something steady and familiar. The next image came, clear and unavoidable. Another door, another person, another opportunity to intervene. Evan didn't move, not yet, but he didn't look away either. Evan stopped pretending the images were accidental. He began to invite them, not deliberately at first, just by not resisting, by letting his mind drift when the pressure settled in his chest, by allowing the half-formed impressions to finish themselves. The thing inside him responded immediately, not with force, with clarity. The images sharpened, faces gained names, places gained routes. The sense of inevitability that followed each vision felt less like a command and more like a conclusion that had already been reached somewhere else. Evan told himself he was still in control. He told himself he could walk away at any moment. The pressure didn't contradict him. That was how it worked now. The second person he chose was careful. Careful in the way people are when they know they're dangerous and believe that self-awareness counts as restraint. He kept his temper behind polite words, his threats disguised as jokes. His history existed in fragments, complaints withdrawn, charges dismissed, witnesses who decided it wasn't worth the trouble. Evan watched him for days. He followed at a distance, learned his schedule, noticed the way people stiffened when he entered a room. The pressure in Evan's chest remained constant, warm and steady, like a hand guiding him forward. This time, there was no doubt, no internal argument. When it ended, Evan felt the same rush of relief as before, cleaner somehow, more complete. The pressure vanished instantly, replaced by a calm so deep it felt artificial. He sat with it for a long time afterward, staring at nothing, letting the quiet settle. The guilt came later, muted, distant. It was easy to rationalize. The thing inside him offered no praise, no condemnation, only silence. That silence became addictive. Evan noticed changes in himself. He walked differently now, shoulders relaxed, movements precise. His thoughts organized themselves quickly, efficiently, as if uncertainty had been trimmed away. People responded to it. Coworkers deferred to him more often. Strangers stepped aside without realizing why. Even conversations felt easier, smoother, as though Evan was always one step ahead. The pressure returned less frequently after the third death. When it did, it no longer arrived as urgency. It arrived as assessment. Evan would see someone and feel the faint tightening in his chest. Not a demand, but a question. This one? Sometimes Evan answered no. The pressure accepted that. Sometimes he answered yes. The relief followed. That terrified him more than the killings ever had, because it meant the thing inside him was no longer choosing. He was. One evening, Evan found himself standing outside the old apartment building again, the one where the first man had died. He hadn't planned to come. His feet had carried him there without conscious direction. The building looked smaller than he remembered, less imposing, almost fragile. Inside, the stairwell smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals and dust. The same narrow steps, the same dim corner. Evan stood at the spot where the body had once been found. The pressure stirred, faint and unfamiliar, not hunger, memory. For the first time since this began, the image of the original man returned without violence attached to it. No push, no fall, just a moment frozen in time. A decision not to act, a choice to look away. Evan understood something then that he hadn't before. The thing inside him hadn't been born from the death itself. It had been born from everything that followed, the silence, the rationalizations, the collective agreement that it was easier not to know. That silence had weight, it had mass, and over time, it had learned to move. Evan felt the pressure shift, tightening briefly, then loosening again. A warning, not from the thing, from himself. He left the building and didn't return. The next image came days later, sharper than the rest. A man Evan recognized immediately, someone from his own life, not close, but close enough to matter. The pressure surged, stronger than it had in weeks. Evan recoiled. "No," he said out loud. "That's not how this works." The pressure didn't recede. It didn't spike either. It stayed, steady, insistent. The images expanded. Incidents Evan had ignored, conversations he'd dismissed, signs he had chosen not to interpret too deeply. This person wasn't innocent, but they weren't obvious either. They existed in that gray space the world tolerated. Evan's chest tightened painfully. "This isn't about finishing something hidden," he whispered. "This is just killing." The pressure shifted, subtle but unmistakable. Correction. The image of the stairwell overlaid the man's face. Then another image layered on top of it. Another death. Another silence. Evan saw the pattern clearly now. The thing born from the first hidden death had outgrown its origin. It no longer cared about that man. It cared about ensuring that no act of violence remained unresolved. Not by exposure, by completion. Evan staggered back, his legs unsteady. "You said this would end," he whispered. The pressure eased, just enough to deliver the answer. It does. Not for everyone. For the one who accepts it fully. Evan spent the night pacing his apartment, the image of the man replaying endlessly in his mind. Every argument he formed collapsed under its own weight. By morning, exhaustion dulled his resistance. The pressure settled into a familiar warmth. He didn't leave the apartment that day. He didn't have to. The thing had learned another trick. The news broke that evening. An altercation. A fight that escalated too quickly. A single fatal outcome. The man Evan had seen was dead. Evan sat on his couch, hands trembling, staring at the screen. He hadn't been there. He hadn't acted. The pressure faded anyway. Relief followed. Sharp. Immediate. Evan laughed softly, a sound halfway to a sob. That was the moment everything changed. The thing inside him had learned how to move without him. It didn't need his hands. It needed his permission, his acceptance, his understanding of how these things should end. Evan felt the pressure brush past him, not stopping, not settling, moving on. The quiet that followed was different from before, not earned, not satisfying, empty. Evan stood and walked to the mirror despite himself. For the first time in weeks, his reflection met his gaze without delay. But something else stood behind it. Not a shape, a presence, diffuse, everywhere. Evan understood then that the thing born from one hidden death had become something larger. A system, a way of thinking, a solution people arrived at on their own when the alternative felt too difficult. Evan pressed his palm to the glass. "I didn't mean for this," he whispered. The reflection smiled faintly. Neither did the first one. Evan backed away, his heart pounding. Outside, sirens wailed, somewhere in the distance. Another ending, another silence. And Evan knew with crushing certainty that the thing would keep moving, with or without him. Evan didn't feel relief anymore. That was how he knew something had gone wrong. Days passed without the familiar warmth in his chest, without the tightening that had once guided his decisions. The pressure no longer arrived to ask questions or offer certainty. It had moved on, leaving behind an emptiness that felt colder than fear. At first, Evan tried to convince himself this was freedom. He woke up without anticipation. He went to work without watching people too closely. He slept through the night without images pushing against his thoughts. But the world around him felt sharper. Conversations carried an edge they hadn't before. People spoke more decisively. Arguments escalated faster. When someone crossed a line, there was less hesitation, less pause before consequences followed. Evan noticed it in the news first. Stories of violence framed as inevitabilities. Headlines that emphasized necessity instead of tragedy. Comment sections filled with certainty. What did they expect? Someone had to stop him. It was only a matter of time. The words echoed thoughts Evan recognized too well. One evening, Evan ran into a woman from his building in the grocery store. He didn't know her name, only her face. She smiled at him, polite but distracted. As she turned to leave, he felt it. Not pressure, movement. Something passed through her, subtle enough that no one else noticed. Her expression sharpened for just a moment, her posture straightening as if she had made a decision she hadn't known she was weighing. Evan staggered back, his cart rattling. She didn't look at him again. That night, Evan dreamed of doors opening by themselves. Not one room, many, across the city, across places he had never been. People stood on thresholds, considering, measuring, choosing. The thing that had once lived inside him moved freely now, carried by logic and justification rather than whispers. It no longer needed a voice. It had learned how to speak through reason. Evan woke with his heart racing. For the first time since this began, he felt truly powerless. He tried to warn people, not directly, not with words like demon or possession. He spoke about patterns, about escalation, about how violence justified once becomes easier to justify again. People nodded politely. Some agreed, too easily. "You're not wrong," one coworker said. "Sometimes there really isn't another option." Evan stopped talking after that. He returned to the old building again, desperate for something familiar. The stairwell was clean, bright, ordinary. No pressure waited there, no images. The place where it had all begun felt hollow now, stripped of meaning. Evan realized then that the original death no longer mattered. The man who had died there had served his purpose. His hidden death had been a seed. The world had grown the rest on its own. That night, Evan sat alone in his apartment, staring at the wall as rain tapped softly against the window. "I didn't stop you," he said aloud. "I helped you." The room remained silent, but he felt something shift, not inside him, but around him. A recognition. The thing hadn't left him entirely. It had changed how it used him. Evan understood his role now. He wasn't a vessel anymore. He was proof. Proof that the logic worked, that the relief was real, that hesitation could be cured. Somewhere, someone would feel that first unbearable pressure and remember, dimly, abstractly, that there was a way through it. They wouldn't hear whispers. They wouldn't see images. They would simply know. And that knowledge would feel like their own idea. Evan stood and walked to the window. Across the street, two people were arguing loudly. Their voices rose, sharp and unforgiving. A third person stepped between them, hands raised, trying to calm things down. For a moment, Evan thought it would end there. Then one of them moved too quickly. Evan turned away before he saw what happened next. Sirens followed minutes later. He sat on the edge of his bed, shaking, finally understanding the full shape of the horror. The demon born from a single hidden death had not become stronger. It had become reasonable. It had taught the world how to finish things quietly, efficiently, convincingly. Evan buried his face in his hands. "There has to be a way to undo this," he whispered. The answer came not as a voice, but as a memory. The stairwell, the moment before the fall, the chance to speak, to act. The thing hadn't been born from the death. It had been born from the silence after. Evan lifted his head slowly. If silence had created it, then noise might be the only thing that could starve it. The thought terrified him. because it meant giving up the last thing the demon had taught him to value: control. Evan reached for his phone. For the first time, he didn't know what would happen next, and that uncertainty felt almost human. Evan didn't call the police. He didn't call a journalist. He didn't call anyone he trusted. Instead, he opened the folder on his laptop he had been building quietly for weeks. Dates, articles, screenshots of comments, patterns highlighted, connected, layered. He had documented everything he could without naming the thing behind it. Not the images, not the pressure, just outcomes, just the way decisions were being justified faster now, cleaner, with less resistance. He had been careful. Now, he stopped being careful. Evan wrote through the night. He wrote about the stairwell, about the man whose death had been labeled an accident because it was easier, about what happened when no one wanted to know. He didn't claim possession. He didn't claim a demon. He wrote about permission, about how violence learned to wear the mask of reason when silence made room for it. He published the piece under his own name, not anonymously. That mattered. By morning, it had been shared more times than he expected. Some people dismissed it immediately. Others argued in the comments, angry, defensive. A few said nothing at all. Those were the ones Evan worried about most. The pressure returned that afternoon, not in his chest, in the room. The air felt thicker, heavier, as if something was gathering around him rather than inside him. Evan sat at his desk, hands steady, breathing slow. "I'm not hiding anymore," he said. The windows rattled softly, not violently, unsettled. The thing was still there, but it no longer fit the way it used to. That night, Evan dreamed of the stairwell one last time. He stood at the top now, looking down. The body was gone. So were the doors. Only the stairs remained, stretching downward into darkness. At the bottom stood the man who had died first. He looked the same as before, whole, uninjured, but his eyes were different. They weren't empty anymore. "You don't get to finish this," Evan said. The man shook his head. "Neither do you," the voice answered. Not through the man, but through the space itself. Evan understood. The thing had never needed him to continue. But it needed him to stop quietly, to disappear, to let the world settle into the pattern it had learned. That was the final temptation, to fade out, to let things proceed without resistance, to accept that what had been started couldn't be undone. Evan woke with his heart pounding. The pressure was there again, pressing inward, trying to collapse him back into compliance. He sat up and spoke before it could settle. "I remember him," Evan said. The pressure wavered. "I remember how it started," he continued, "and I'm not going to let you turn that into something clean." The room creaked softly as if the building itself were listening. Evan began telling people everything. Not in one place, everywhere. He spoke at community meetings, he emailed editors, he posted follow-ups, naming patterns more clearly now, refusing to soften his language when people tried to reframe it. He talked about the cost of hesitation and the greater cost of ending it the wrong way. The backlash was immediate. Threats, mockery, accusations of fear-mongering. But something else happened too. People started questioning stories they had once accepted. They asked why certain cases had been closed so quickly, why some deaths were called inevitable while others were investigated endlessly. The thing pushed back. Violence spiked in places where the narrative was challenged hardest. Louder, messier, unmistakable. Evan didn't stop. Each time the pressure returned, it felt weaker, less certain, less unified. He realized then that the thing had never been singular. It had been an agreement, and agreements could fracture. The final night came quietly. Evan sat alone in his apartment, the city humming outside his window. He felt no pressure now, no warmth, no guiding hand, just exhaustion. He knew the thing hadn't been destroyed. That wasn't how it worked, but it had been forced into the open. It no longer moved effortlessly through silence. It had to push harder, reveal itself through excess rather than restraint. That made it vulnerable. Evan stood and approached the mirror. His reflection met his gaze without delay. No smile, no presence behind him, just himself. "I don't forgive you," Evan said softly, to the reflection, to the memory of the dead man, to himself, "but I won't help you anymore." The lights flickered once, then steadied. Months later, the world felt rougher. Arguments didn't end as quickly. Decisions took longer. People hesitated again, and that hesitation carried weight. Violence didn't vanish, but it lost its certainty. its easy justifications began to fail. Evan watched from a distance, knowing what it had cost him. Some nights when he passed stairwells or stood in long hallways, he felt a faint pressure brush past him. Not asking, not guiding, just remembering. He never looked away, because he understood the final truth now. The demon born from a hidden death had never been ancient. It had been new, fragile, sustained by the belief that silence was safer than truth. And as long as someone remembered the cost of that silence, it would never fully return.